So before we get started, let me mention something that's really cool. So in a week and a day, Berkeley is launching a fundraising effort called Big Give. And if you go on biggive.berkeley.edu on November 20th, in a week and a day, and you donate to the physics department, then whatever gets raised by the physics department gets split among the student organizations within the physics department, including eigenspectrum. And since you're all here for eigenspectrum, I know you're all interested in it. So please, on November 20th, go to biggive.berkeley.edu and help us out a little bit. That way, we can continue doing events like these, where we're hosting Dr. Ming. So Dr. Ming graduated from Carnegie Mellon, and since then has done a lot of things at the intersection of cognition and technology. And she's doing several startups in industry, one of which is sort of maximizing human capital within a workplace. And this is at Guilds, where she serves as chief scientist. She also has her own startup, Socos, and there she's sort of using cognitive models of students' perception, I guess, of information. I suppose we'll hear more about it later. In order to...
You should just give them up.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'll give the rest of it. But she's also visiting scientist here at the Redwood Center for Neuroscience, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. But also, she is quite the advocate for LGBT+ issues in the community, where she serves on the board of, I think, 2 organizations. 3 now, all right. My info is outdated. Please correct me, Dr. Ming, the floor is yours.
I have a problem saying no. So the first step to rectifying the problem is acknowledging it. I don't think I'm going to fix that problem now. So what's the makeup of the room? You're all filthy, awful physicists. I understand that much. But undergrad versus grad, what am I looking at here? Who's getting out of here in a year?
Like 1 month.
1 month. Ah.
Yay.
And you're spending it one of those precious days with me. I appreciate that. So, for comparison, I did my undergrad at UC San Diego, where everyone goes thinking they're going to be a doctor. I think 85% of the incoming freshmen are bio majors, or at least they were back when I was there. And life didn't quite go the way I thought, or anyone around me thought. And I hit bottom in high school and barely scraped by. I never knew I was smart, but it just wasn't quite there. I did flunk out of college, and not even at some place challenging. It's a safety school. Eventually didn't just check out of college, I checked out of life. I don't even have any good stories about it. It wasn't like, at least I can talk about, being a pirate in the South Seas or being tripped out on acid all the time. I don't even drink coffee. I just was a deeply unhappy person. And I will come back to how I ended up here doing interesting things, but I wanted to start with that as a bit of an insight and motivation for me, which is I did eventually sort of get back into the swing of things. My undergrad only took me a measly 11 years, which really amounted to nothing. I'm not going to count it out 10 times. And then finally I went back to school and did the entire thing in a single year. But by then I was in my late 20s, not exactly old, but old by some people's standards, not by mine anymore. And when I think about those times, I think about what I've done since and what I did before. I'll be very blunt, I didn't do anything before. I didn't add any value to anyone's life in a sort of big, broad, big picture sense, and probably not much in a specific sense. And since then, I will say with a complete lack of humility, I've done incredible things. awesome things, and I'm immensely proud of them. I think about how many chances I got, how much privilege I had. In case anyone here didn't realize it, I was born white and male in California with very educated, not wealthy, but certainly successful parents. I had enormous advantages, and they stuck with me for those 25 years of nothing and unhappiness, until I finally kind of got my life together. How many people could be doing what I'm doing? But they didn't get 100 chances. They didn't get 3 chances. Maybe some of them didn't even get 1 chance. So it brings me to the big motivating question in my life, as this catches up with my completely impromptu ramble. I'll probably need to come back to this in a moment. But this, what is the economic cost of unrealized human potential? Think of it broadly. In labor markets, in inefficient labor markets, in underperforming education systems, in inequity in healthcare, in treatable mental illness that simply isn't treated. Think about what those numbers might be. Think you're math people. Somehow, just by not being a math person, I've ended up being essentially an applied mathematician in my professional life. How would you go about estimating what that number is? What the impact of an inefficient labor market is? Failing schools. So this is what I do. I'm not posing this as a thinker. I really work on trying to figure out what that number is. But of course, the reason I think about it is, how do we drive that number to 0? What can we do today that, granting some lag time for things to take an effect, we might actually see the economic cost? It's never going to be 0, but something that we can look at. What could all of those kids like me that didn't get 100 tries, what could they have done? How could they have changed your life? So to be fair, I should point out a few things. I'm no longer the chief scientist at Guild. On October 18th, I stepped down because I'm now working on a white paper for the White House on the future of labor markets. So when you combine big data and machine learning and behavioral sciences and industrial psychology and so forth, let's make up a term, since I'm nominally a computational neuroscience, let's call it computational HR, and say, can we advocate within the White House for the formation, probably the next White House, for the formation of a CTO position in the Department of Labor to create an entirely new field, computational HR. Dump a bunch of money into it, the same way that we're dumping a bunch of money into neuroscience right now, which I think is awesome. And create this field and really leverage what's possible. And I'll talk a little bit about what's possible because that's what I do in my life. I am still the founder and managing partner of Socos, which I co-founded with my wife and a former student of mine who is here for a year at the Redwood Center, Megan Bombacher, who now is over at Stanford, sorry to say. And I'm a visiting scholar at the Redwood Center. I also sit on a number of boards, Emoja, Credit Suisse, our family coalition, which is the largest LGBT family coalition based here in San Francisco. Start out as a national LGBT entrepreneurship organization. And the coolest new one that is not there yet is something called the Bay Area Rainbow Day Camp, which is a day camp for boring gender inclusive. It's for kids that are experimenting with gender, and someplace they can go to actually be accepted and be embraced. I don't actually do anything at any of those. People just ask me to sit on their boards and pay me such big money that how can I say no? So just to have a bit of context, and also because it's somewhat relevant to being here, in October, I spent 22 days traveling through 6 cities. One of those cities was Pittsburgh, which is where Carnegie Mellon's located. I was there to be the student keynote for the 20th anniversary of the institute where I got my PhD, the Center for the Neurobase of Cognition. So I did my PhD in psychology at CMU, and then there's a computational neuroscience program which the CNBC runs. It's very flattering. It wasn't that it formalized it after I left, and I was told by one of my former advisors that basically the way they put it together was, what would Vivienne have wanted? Which is interesting, because that's how I hear it in my mind, but it wasn't the name anyone would have used at the time. So I put this talk together for that presentation, and I had promised to bring my family along, because my wife, we met in grad school at Carnegie Mellon, and I realized that if I flew them all out to Pittsburgh and back, I wouldn't be able to afford the new Google phone that's coming out. So I chose material happiness over family. It's worth noting how angry I am that I have been unable to buy the Nexus 6. So that's my daughter Athena, my son Felix, and Norma, again, the co-founder at Socos. That is us. During that trip, I had them flown down to LA so that I could see them. We went to Disneyland. That's the Jungle Cruise, which is amazingly just as sort of shockingly racist as I remembered it when I was a kid. But you can see Athena's she's 3. All right, so this is how I started off that trip. It was in Las Vegas, which is my favorite city in the world because I don't drink, I don't gamble, I don't like Las Vegas. Wait a minute, it's not my favorite city. And I was there for the HR Tech Conference, which, again, not a big reason to go to Las Vegas. But they asked me to be on this panel, so the guy way down there is the senior vice president at IBM, this other guy next to me is from HP, and we were up there to talk about the future of HR. What are we going to be able to do in 5 years, 10 years? And, you know, it was fun. Actually, it was very flattering. The guy in the far end afterwards walked up to me and he said, I'd like to just follow you around and catch all the sparks that come off. And I said, yeah, I think I'd love to be a professional fire hazard. So what did we talk about? I'm not really going to dive too deep into this, except this final crappy matplot plot I'll come back to. Oh, it's a little chopped off. But here's the really quick tour of what I did at Guild as chief scientist, and what part of what we're writing into this white paper on the future of labor markets. So Guild is a really cool company, and I'm only saying that because I still own a lot of shares in it, that takes data from all over the web, about 100 different websites. We pull it all in, and amazingly, the really tough part is making certain it's the same person. You know, because I'm, let's see how many people I lose with my dated references. So on LinkedIn, they're Thurston Howell III. On GitHub, they're Crankosaurus. Okay, there's one smile. So, and they, you know, they're trying to keep these lives separate, and we want to cram them all together because we want to pull all of this public data. It's all public data. All together in one place. So right there, some fun little technology. We actually run facial recognition stuff off of the photos of different websites, build a Bayesian model that says how similar the names, the birthdays, were they at the same high schools. It actually does a shockingly good job, but it really was a really challenging problem to make something with all the same people. So from all that data we put together, I get a database, 120 million people, on top of which my team and I used to build models that predict how good people are at their jobs. We started with developers, and the goal of which is to say, why don't you hire a good developer instead of hiring a Stanford degree? Just as an example. Wouldn't it be nice if you could go in and do some unbiased hiring? So take, for example, this one fellow I know, his name is Jay Dominguez. He was actually a pretty good high school student, but as it turns out, he never went to college. No one in his family ever had. Lived down in LA, never worked at a big corporation before. He, I practice my talks. So he was selling t-shirts. He had this just sort of entrepreneurial idea. I'm just going to sell t-shirts. He started a website like WordPress, sold a few t-shirts, thought, I can do better than this. This site sucks. Taught himself how to program Ruby. Built his own website. More t-shirts. Thought, this could be better still. Eventually, he was building onto the code base of Ruby. And then he thought, why the hell am I selling t-shirts? I could go to Silicon Valley, I could get real money. So for about a year, he was sending resumes up here, saying, hey, I'm awesome, hey, I'm awesome. And here's what happened, because this has been studied pretty closely. The recruiters will take that resume, you get 5 seconds. They look at the name, Dominguez. I mean, really, you want to get hired, what sort of name is Dominguez to have? The school, nothing. Previous job, nothing. Into the trash. 5 seconds. It isn't even worth their time to say no. So he never, for a year, he never even heard back from a single company, many of whom were probably running behind the scenes the Ruby code that he had written. So then along one day, some startup calls him up out of the blue and says, hey, our algorithm tells us you're the second best Ruby developer in all of Los Angeles. Can we fly you up here for an interview? So that was us. We were the first consumers. We ate our own dog food, as they say. And we hired the guy, and he was awesome. In fact, now he's gone. He started his own company. We didn't do him a favor. We did ourselves a favor by discovering someone who had some real talent and not getting caught up in what the pedigree was. Turns out, yeah, screw you. Turns out, they, one of the first things I did at Guild was I went through, we have this giant database, specifically developers, we now have about 11 million total, which might be close to the worldwide professional developer population. And I said, okay, so how many of these people have really fancy credentials, some snooty school like UC Berkeley, and are really good according to our algorithms? And how many people are just really good and don't have that kind of credential? Turned out it varies a little bit by a particular expertise, but essentially it's 10 to 100 times as many. That's how many people get ignored when your hiring is based on Google's original hiring plan, which was the orders laid down from the founders, we will only hire from the top 5 schools. Berkeley's number 5 on the list. You know, it's worth noting neither of them went to such a school, not as an undergrad. Neither of them graduated from a top 5 school. But that was their marching order. So for a long time, that was how Google hired. You had to come from one of those schools or otherwise be massively distinguished. Until behind their backs, literally behind their backs, their people, what's it called? People, not people analytics.
People
What's that?
People dev?
Something like that, yeah. They ran a secret experiment to see what is predictive of success inside Google. And you know what they managed to do? They managed to rediscover 60 years worth of education research. Which is that what really predicts success inside Google is not your degree, it's not the school you went to, it's certainly not your grades or your SAT scores, which I will strongly support as well. Those are not predictive of anything in terms of life outcomes. And rather, when I know other things about you, they are uninformative. What was predictive? Things like your motivational set. Are you endogenously motivated? Or are you exogenously motivated? Endogenous, as a student, you're intellectually curious. You do the work because you want to know. Exogenously, I want to get the praise. I want the praise from my professors. I don't want to get punished by my parents. Exogenous motivation. Recent bit of research, just published this last year in PNAS, I believe, looked at West Point students and found that grades, shock of all shocks, was a great predictor of whether they graduated or not, but didn't predict anything about their career. What rank would they get to? What awards would they earn? Endogenous motivation, they called it intrinsic motivation, technically not the same thing. They were wrong. Endogenous motivation is a strong predictor, not only of graduation, but of those life outcomes. Exogenous motivation, as it turns out, any of you slaving under Tiger Mom, is a negative predictor, both of graduation and of life outcomes. In fact, it even undermines whatever endogenous motivation we be holding. So it turns out there are a number of these things. I put it under a big blanket. I call it meta-learning, just because the whole field is a mess and nobody has good terminology. These are the things that are predictive. And it's not great. You know, Bachelor of Computer Science from Stanford turns out to be a very modest positive predictor of whether you're a decent developer. If you're curious, we developed, oh yeah, Max. You know, press buttons. We developed this graph-based system for ranking things like ranking companies, ranking schools, ranking locations, metro regions, and doing a variety of other things. So we build this big graph out, and then we have a model of how heat diffuses through the system. So literally, I can tell you what are the hottest schools, what's the hottest company, and it gives us a beautiful ranking. So Stanford, Caltech, MIT, CMU, and Berkeley are the top 5 according to our rankings. They're very modest papers. In other words, to pay you all a compliment, you're fine. I'm sure most of you are. And when you hit the job market, people will really appreciate that degree. It will carry a lot of weight for you. But that's the wrong thing. It's what got you to Berkeley in the first place that will also make you successful in your career. 90%. And the degree turns out to only be a very modest value add, except for the signaling cost. That's the economic term. There's some signaling that needs to get done here. And you have paid for 4 years of your life to have that signal that you can send out to the world. We can go through and rank school regions by not just who has the most great developers, but who has the highest density of them. And it breaks my heart to see that Washington, Seattle area nips out the Bay Area at the top spot. But it gets very interesting after that. Very university driven. Oxford, I think we're seeing Cornell effectively below that, UT Austin, ETH. This thing. So there's fun little things I can do. We go build models of company culture. I can build models that predict how long you'll stay on the job. I can build a model that is lifetime employee value, which may sound very dry. You don't want to be a number. But what if I could tell a potential employer of yours how to maximize lifetime employee value by dumping value into you up front, train you for the job. People shouldn't hire for skills. They should hire for cultural fit. If anyone wants a tour through the technical details of the models I'm referring to, I'm happy to do it. But usually my audiences wouldn't understand, so I'm sort of out of the habit. They should hire for cultural fit and these real, genuine predictors. What's the difference between doing the two? If I hire for skills, I get 2.5 years of average productivity out of summer. I know I'm putting it in these dry economic terms, but it's numbers that we can compare. 2.5 years, people are shocking. It's like a perfect gamma distribution, or at least for tech employment. And the mass of that distribution is between 2 and 3 years. So 2.5 years of average performance, higher for cultural fit, not programmer version of cultural fit, but real complementarity. And the actual predictor success, you get 4.5 years of above average performance. 4.5 years, why don't we just take 6 months to train the person how to do the job? You get 4 years of above average performance. So there's some real value. This might be a room you can appreciate, that we can put some equations around who you are and optimize you. And the value to you then is, if you go get a job at Google, they have an incentive to putting value into you. That's the future of labor markets. Do what IBM used to do decades and decades ago, but nobody does anymore, which is actually train your workforce. Turns out there's a real payoff to that. Cool stuff that we do at Guild, or I used to do, going through and doing deep text processing. So what's a strong predictor of whether someone is good at their job, if it's not their skill set and their degree. Actually, I should say a PhD is fairly predictive. It's just a PhD in anything. PhD in philosophy is predictive of you being a good developer. It's that you're stupid enough to want to spend 5 years of your life working on a problem for nothing. That predicts that you're kind of overmotivated. So Selly is awesome. that person has brain damage. Celery's disgusting, you cook with it, you throw it in the trash. Celery is awesome. What if they're a Python developer? What if they're talking about the multiprocessing toolkit for Python? Now we have a 1,000,000 node probabilistic graph that starts with that fact and then produces a probability distribution over skill levels of different related technologies and languages. They almost certainly know Rabbit, MQ, or Redis for message passing. They're probably using it in a Pythonic web framework like Flask or Django, just very standard for Celery. Imagine what that says about someone. They shared it with passion to their friends at 2 a.m. What is wrong with this person? What that says about their Python ability compared to them saying Python on their resume. This person knows Python. At least we have a very strong clue suggesting it's in that direction. Everybody says Python on their resume. I don't know about you guys, you probably have all dabbled with it, or MATLAB, or something close to it. You think, yeah, I know Python, you put it on there. So everyone from Guido van Rostrom to someone that took, a 6-week course on, introduction to programming and happened to be in Python. They all say, I took Python on the resume. That says something. So we go through and do this deep text processing. We actually do deep text processing questions and answers on Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow. Because it turns out follows and upvotes and stuff like that, that's garbage. One of my favorite papers of all time came out in the mid-2000s. It goes by a title something like an experimental analysis of inequality and I'm blanking on the next name. Chaos stuff in online virtual markets. And they did this amazing piece of research where people entered into, they were actually signing up for new music sites. So think like the recent Facebook thing, but done years ago when nobody realized you were getting abused. Isn't it great that the one time someone actually tells you that they did something with your data, they get punished for it? What do you think is going to happen the next time they do a full experiment? So, unbeknownst to people entering that site, which is really new music, like you never even heard the bands, much less the songs, they were randomly assigned to one of 9 virtual worlds. In the first world, you never saw anyone else's ranking on songs. You listened to them, you ranked them. You listened to them, you ranked them. In the other 8 worlds, you saw rankings and the orderings of songs based on the average ranking for that population, that little virtual world. So they found 3 things. 1, there really is good and bad music. 3 people gave a song a 6 or 7, 4th person probably gonna give it to it also. And the other end, down around 3s. But that's the range, it's a subtle fact. So there are no 0s, there are no 10s, but there's genuinely sort of at a population level differences. Finding number 2, as soon as you see other people's rankings, bam, big nonlinear effects. Suddenly those 6s and 7s become 10s. And the 3s become 0s, and things sort of flatten out. So now we have this big sort of, it's not a sigmoid, it's the opposite. Okay, all right, so it's monotonic. We can squash that back to something approximating the original data. And think about what people use this information for. It's kind of important. Third finding, across those 8 virtual worlds, completely non-overlapping groups of songs got the nonlinear kick. If you were 10 in one world, not a single song that was a 10 in one world was a 10 in any of the others. So you had to be good to be in contention, but you rerun the world. Oh, Facebook, I remember Friendster bought them, right? Beyonce, she was in that group. Yeah, I think I remember who she is. Then the Stones, they had a hit, like in the 60s. Rerun the world, and their research, and a lot of research since then, says these are chaotic effects. Not really predictable what will happen. You have to be good, Beyond that, you don't know. So looking at upvotes and things like that, it's garbage and it doesn't do you any good. So go deep. Text processing, unstructured data. I love unstructured data. This is the last thing, Joe versus Jose. I'm going to come back to it at the end because I want to, I'm already jabbering on too much, but I want to leave some time for questions and answers, and I think that's really relevant to some of the things we might be talking about. Yeah. All right, so this is my wife and co-founder. She actually used to be faculty here at the School of Education. This is us giving a keynote address at Socos CPU, so the opening keynote for the whole event. That's me wearing Google Glass. Thankfully, I'm not wearing the same dress. Typically, I take my sort of style cues from Marge Simpson. So we got up there, and the talk we were giving was keeping the promise of educational technology. And let me give you a big clue in, nobody is keeping that promise. And I'm a true believer. I have an education company. And trust me, it's deeply technology-based. And I genuinely believe in some of the players in the space. Carnegie Learning came out of Carnegie Mellon. I know Andrew fairly well, published a paper with him once. At Coursera, and Daphne Kohler is amazingly brilliant, so is Sebastian Thrun. All of these people are honest, good players. So why is it the promise of educational technology has never been kept? So that's what we talked about here. Go look it up and watch it. It'll only take you about an hour. So what we try to do to keep that promise is to respect the fact that one of the things missing is, and I say this for posterity's sake, so I'm going to get a drive-by punch from Andrew at some point, I guess. It takes a Stanford professor to think that the hard part about education is simply making information available. The hard part about education, particularly as a business, is that 99% of your market actively doesn't want to buy your product. I've given lectures at some pretty swanky universities, and a lot of people sleeping in the pews. And that's Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, Berkeley. Forget, a kid in elementary school that has no reason to believe this is ever going to pay off for them. So how do you reach everyone else? How do you produce a tool that does more than decide who's going to go to Brown versus Princeton? You want to participate in the educational arms race, go for it. There's money to be made there. There will always be obsessive parents that will pay God knows what to make certain that their kid gets to go to the school, which isn't actually predictive of them having a good life. But it's not my personal interest. Anyone care to take a guess at what this is?
Canada Goose.
Someone actually went, to me it's much more like a tropical bird, flapping its wings. This is more crappy Matplotlib stuff, but here in 3D with the camera rotating around it. Every one of the points is posted in an online discussion by a student, color-coded by the time during the course. I think this is an economics course, MBA students. And you can see that over the course of the course, the spaces are semantic spaces. You see that the students are discussing different topics. But really I show it just because it moves. Oh gosh, this is the end of the slide. Okay, so a couple of years ago my wife and I published a paper, initially at NIPS, and then it went on from there, where we showed that we could take something like an online discussion between the students. So those MBA students just talking to each other about economics. We can learn economics from those students using a variant by significant variant of hierarchical latent derivative allocation. So we can learn the concept space that they're discussing. Then, and it was a lot of students, I will admit, as you get the sense, when 20,000 new students came into those courses with new instructors and new assessments, we knew at week 1 what grade they would get. As the course progressed, we knew with greater and greater accuracy what they get wrong or right on the final exam. So if we know what they're going to get on the final exam, why are we wasting time on exams? why don't we teach the competency? And use a technology not unlike this to do it. If we know at week 2 that they're not going to get a certain concept at week 3, and then I can say, oh, and by the way, students with this type of student with this type of misconcept, here are three educational interventions that have been shown to be highly effective. The way I put it is the goal of Socos is to give teachers and parents a superpower to read their students' minds, read their children's minds, and know what to do next. Much more interesting than this is what I'll get to at the end, because I just told you grades aren't predictive of anything, which is sort of was a depressing thing because I published the paper while I was chief scientist at Guild, so I was sort of doing the 2 companies at the same time. And it was sort of depressing to think that we could do this incredibly cool thing which isn't going to help anybody. So I'll come back to that. This is Felix. Felix is awesome. He, like me, has a lot of advantages in life. You know, white guy in California. Not quite as well off as my father got my family too, but you know, we're both scientists and educated, and who knows, maybe I will win the entrepreneurial lottery someday. And then Felix was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. It takes a little while for diabetes to sort of accumulate the symptoms. If you don't know, it's an autoimmune disease. You get a virus. The virus presumably presents some protein that unfortunately looks structurally similar to a protein produced in islet cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. So your immune system gets really good at knocking out those viruses, and then it says, oh, look, there's more of them, and then it spends the rest of your life killing off the cells that make insulin, which you need to process sugar. So here he is. He was 40 pounds probably 2 weeks before that picture was taken, and he was 25 pounds in that picture. His body had started to break down his muscle and fat to stay alive. So that was the worst Thanksgiving ever, although that pillow was so awesome. His nurse, her mom, hand sews holiday-themed pillowcases for all of the kids that spend the holidays in the hospital. Just like it, feel weepy. And we still have that pillow. It's on his bed right now. My head may very well end up on his back. So now the story of his life is totally changed. First off, you're scared. Your kid has a chronic illness, and what are you going to do? Like, you know, I was already the kind of pokey mom that would like walk in the room. You know, are you okay? You're still breathing, right? Okay, no, sure, I'm going to go back to sleep. I already had those fears, but after a little while, you realize that this isn't going to happen. Or maybe it will, but stuff happens. You know, comets occasionally hit planets. You can't control everything. We do the best we can, and we get by. And what became frustrating to me is back with this story about human potential. Suddenly his story has changed. He's starting to get a rep from his teachers. He's not paying attention in class. He's not, you know, he's sort of emotional. Well, yeah, he's doing a shitty job taking care of his blood sugar level. His blood sugar is 400. It's like he's got ADHD. It's 50, and you'd be crying too. So, okay, how do we take care of this? Well, you do a really good job of treating diabetes. And I wonder what the next slide is. I'll come back to that. So we were so engaged. I mean, he's got 2 scientists for him. We'd already been running experiments on our kids. So this is hardly different. So we started recording everything. I still have the Google Docs spreadsheet. First line, goose, 169 grams. That was the Thanksgiving meal that we had missed, but was the first thing he ate outside the hospital. Everything he ate in that meal. Everything he ate afterwards for a whole month, every blood glucose reading, every piece of data we could accumulate, what was his activity levels. All this data, we were so excited. We brought it in to the hospital with us, to his doctor and his nurses, people I actually still go to and still respect. They were angry with us. Angry that we wasted their time. He said, do this. They gave us a sheet of paper. It had 5 days, 3 boxes, write a blood glucose level for 5 days. We have data for 30 days, everything. No, this, write it out. We did it, they held it up in front of themselves, just eyeballed it for 2-3 minutes, and said, okay, here's what we're gonna do for the next month. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. this is how we treat diabetes or anything? So in that moment, I said, screw this. I build models of the brain. You think diabetes is harder than that? So I'm not actually going to explain much here, except to say the ideal goal, what your pancreas is doing, is keeping your blood sugar as flat as possible. The reason some of you might someday end up with type 2 diabetes is because you eat things that your body can't keep up with. So start your day off with Jamba Juice and you're well on your way. Cereal, actually, Norma, my wife, wore what's called a continuous glucose monitor. Every 5 minutes it spits out an estimate of your blood sugar levels. And we saw what happened when she, a perfectly healthy person, ate cereal in the morning, and we have never bought cereal since then. So if that's the purpose of a functioning pancreas, well, what if I just built, some Bayesian, it was a little involved, but it's not magic. A little Bayesian this, a little dynamical systems that. The goal of which is to flatten out. So first, learn the long-term parameter settings for the insulin pump. Second, given the settings, give me a set of optimal insulin doses for a given set of food that he's eating. So in other words, predict blood sugar into the future. It's very similar to stuff I'd done when I was a graduate student, modeling perceptual systems, where we're doing predictive coding. How do we minimize the number of bits of information necessary to code a system? Predict where that system's going to be a few seconds from now, and then you'll have to code the differences. So we sort of leverage that, but had to do it in this differential space. And it doesn't say much, except this is just a simulation here that I ran before I ran it on my son. Over there is with a standard dosing regimen, and then next to it here on your left is with the system running. But the really cool thing that I hadn't really planned, but it seems obvious in respect, it also gives me an estimate into the future. This is a confidence interval around where his blood sugar ought to be an hour from now. And as soon as it diverges from that, I'm not wearing my Google Glass anymore, but it would send me a text message. He's going to be high, he's going to be low. It was never wrong. I could text his school and say, hey, give Felix a cracker, and then he won't go low. The frustrating part is I literally can't give that away. If I gave it to someone else, it would be giving medical advice. So instead, I donated it to a nonprofit called the Theoretical Foundation, which they describe themselves as the Mozilla for diabetes. So it's a nonprofit that builds open source software for diabetes. Now there are 600 people using whose data is passing through this system because they're using it for fun. You have to kind of sign disclosure up front. I absolutely would never use this to treat diabetes or monitor my health states. But there's an interesting idea. If I got 600 people and all of their data is constantly going through my system, do I even care what people used to know about diabetes? Can I say something fundamentally new and different? Not just personalized, but what happens to bioinformatics, to medicine, to fields like neuroscience and psychology when we start to collect data at massive scales like this continuously? Stuff that nobody's ever seen in a standard experiment. So I have this running on Felix, and then this is my daughter, Dina. She's 3 now, and she needed to do a little dance because she has a negative space unicorn t-shirt on, and this skirt that really did it. She just, every day she comes out and says, I'm an Elsa, and then it runs on from there. This morning was, I'm an Elsa, mermaid, butterfly, princess. I told her recently that I actually met a princess, which I did, a Saudi princess. And I said, she had an actual job. So every now whenever she tells me she's a princess, I say, that's great. What do you actually do for a living? So by age 3 years old, right? It's a perfect setup. I will have to use that image forever now on how long I give this talk. By age 3, there's a 30 million word gap. In other words, 3-year-olds from high socioeconomic status families hear 30 million words. more than kids from low socioeconomic status families. And there's a ton of research, a lot of it coming out of Stanford, that shows this is a causal factor in performance gains from kids from high SES families. So remember what I said early, long time ago. Some of these kids never even getting one chance. By age 3, we've already created a deficit in the minds of 20% of lowest earning households in the United States, which, by the way, is 50% of the population. Marry that with another study from the early 2000s. Kids who grow up in high-stress households, that high-stress household is a causal factor in having a decreased working memory span. Working memory span, it's one of those meta-learning things. Hugely predictive of life outcomes. It's not just how many numbers and letters you can keep in mind. It's the complexity of an argument you can entertain. It's the richness of your imagination. Literally making those kids stupider. Did they ever have a chance to do what I've been able to do? So, what can we do about it? Here's some disparities. You see the difference between low working class and college-educated parents. This is cumulative vocabulary. You can see the kids of those parents have, a hugely expanded vocabulary of, say, my kids versus kids from low-income parents by the time they're 3 years old. And essentially, you can see that the 18-month-old red line is the same as the 24-month-old green line. It's really disturbing and disappointing. So 20 years ago in Kingston, Jamaica, of all places, they run an intervention. This story involves UC Berkeley, by the way. And this is some of the actual stimuli that were used during those interventions. So they identified severely at-risk toddlers. And they sent social workers who periodically go to their home, work briefly with their parents, not with the kids, with their parents. Teach them about nutrition, social-emotional parenting skills, basic stuff. Now, 20 years later, a paper published just this year from some people here at Berkeley and economics, University of Chicago. Those kids, now adults, earn 25% more than their at-risk peers. They spend less time incarcerated. Some other friends of mine ran an almost identical intervention with low SES African-American children in the United States. They're health psychologists. What they're interested in is cortisol levels, inflammatory response, big predictor of life health outcomes. 8 years later, those kids not just had significantly, but substantially lower cortisol levels. Imagine, again, 50% of households in the United States, 20 years from now, earn 25% more on average. The males spent less time incarcerated and had better health outcomes. You want to start thinking about what is the economic cost of unrealized human potential. You can really start to put some numbers together from that. So what's my attempt to actually do something about it? This is just one version of something Socos is working on. This is jointly with UT Austin called Kindersight. We're working with migrant kindergartners. So they're in English immersion classes, putting recordings or instrumenting their classrooms, playgrounds, even at home, recording everything they say, everything that gets said to them by adults, by peers, parents, and ideally someday in real time. But for now, we're doing it sort of day by day in patches. We process that, automatic speech recognition, we parse out the speakers. There is actual software for doing that right now. Just doing it at scale in real time is another question. And leveraging the kind of stuff we built, and I talked about earlier for those college students, we can make recommendations. But instead of recommendations about course outcomes, we are making predictive assessments aligned with life outcomes. Lifetime income, lifetime educational attainment, health, and squishy stuff, happiness, social health. That 25%, what if, and this is what we're doing, we send a text home every day to their parents, every single day. This is the single thing you can do tonight that will have the biggest impact on your child's life. And then we send another one tomorrow, and another one the day after that. and we're recording. In many cases, we'll record the actual intervention taking place. We will certainly record the child the next day at school, and the next week, and the next month, and close that loop and see, was that an effective intervention? And to think, how could we scale these systems out so we can affect people across the country and ideally across the world? So, certainly I could wire up every kid. There's something out there already called Lena that can do something like this. If I want to shell out $5,000 a student, can we do it with like Radio Shack mics and a Raspberry Pi? That's what I want to do. I want to say, can I do it in any classroom in the United States? So that's the Lena system I described. There's, because I used this fancy word texting, I included the mobile phone so you get what I was talking about. But of course that's sort of important. It needs to be text. I can't presume that these migrant parents are going to have smartphones, much less a computer, and I certainly can't assume that's going to be the case, say in Africa, where I'd love to expand this to. And we can send a text, hey, Dad, Maria is really excited about seahorses right now. Take 15 minutes and talk to her about seahorses. Sounds simple, sounds subtle, it's a just-in-time recommendation, a just-in-time intervention, given right there that night as he sees the kid. We specifically target Dad. We specifically target talk to instead of read. The whole thing is driven by all of this research in meta learning and what's most effective. And we do it all without a single test. So now all of our stuff at college level is also life outcomes. I don't care whether you learn chemistry, because it turns out that's not what's going to get you a job. So you go through a Weeder course, and I realize this is not a threat to any of you, but say you go through an organic chemistry Weeder course, and you come out knowing more chemistry but less confident in yourself. Guess which of those matter when you hit the job market? So part of what we do, I won't name names, but some of our customers, to them it's just existential. They want to show that they actually add value to their students' lives so that they can say, please keep coming to our liberal arts college because we do something worthwhile. As opposed to the reality is, which in almost every case, there really is no value add currently. But what we can do is parse apart where the value comes from and where it's getting lost so they can actually focus on the things that are effective. And we also just signed the nonprofit that runs the New York City, the at-risk population of the New York City school system. So we just got 17,000 new kids into our system to run variants of this. This ranges pre-K through 12. So I'm really super excited about all this stuff. Again, I haven't gone into the details. This is the first ever presidential portrait using a Google Glass. And I like to show it off simply because he was so disgusted. I got invited to his White House thing, and you can see the Secret Service is holding everybody back. He met 3 people that day. I assume the other 2 must have been donors or something. And I realized, I sort of figured out after the fact, the one reason he met me is because I wasted 10 minutes of the most powerful man in the world's time deciding whether to kick me out because I was wearing Google Glasses at the White House. So he came over and just shook his head. And it was like, it's a memory I treasure. So as it turns out, these numbers are wrong. So Google, that was their market cap a few months ago. Mars, that's the median estimate of what it would cost to put a long-term colony on Mars. High ends, which is probably more accurate, are more like 800 billion. This human potential number is wildly wrong. So McKinsey, the big consulting firm, did a study. It was a bit utopian. What if we were as good as Finland and education was equitable? As a result of that, turns out we would inject $3 to $4 billion a year into the economy. $3 to $4 trillion a year into the economy. So what I did is I took some of these numbers that we talked about earlier, and I said, what if we could scale these out? What if we could actually make these changes? It's not quite 3 to 4 trillion, but the range is 1.3 to 1.8 trillion dollars a year, just in the United States, just from affecting that bottom quintile of household earners, just in education. Forget labor markets, forget healthcare, mental health, I mentioned mental health, by the way, because I sit on the board of this company called Emosia, and which is founded by this guy who, this is how he does deals. He starts getting excited, he starts jumping up and down like a 12-year-old girl. Yeah, he's gay. And but like celebratorily so, and everybody loves it, and he like goes in there, and pretty soon like the CEO of AT&T is jumping up and down with him, and then there's a deal. Wait a minute, they don't actually know how to do what they're claiming to do yet. That's why they asked me to join their board. So we're doing continuous passive emotion estimation, just using Android phones, using all the passive sensors on the system. We know what you're feeling. And I agreed to do that if we would use that technology to predict manic and depressive episodes and bipolar sufferers. So imagine you could go drug-free most of the time, and then you and some trusted confidants get a text or an email or otherwise a warning that says, hey, high probability of a manic episode in the next week or two. Why don't you up your medication, check in with your doctor, and maybe take a week off from work. Don't get fired. Don't get divorced. Turns out $70 billion a year just for bipolar disorder. So that's a vastly bigger number than what unfortunately got written onto this slide. And I will stop here because I've talked way, way, way too long. And I wanted to leave some time for questions. But I also wanted to say one thing that I've been doing for the labor markets research, which is highly relevant. And it comes back to this idea of signaling. Signaling costs. Think of signaling costs as the cost of being different. It's the tax on being different. So how do we measure signaling costs? Well, I have a database of 120 million people, or at least I used to, and now LinkedIn wants to work with me, so cool. So here's an example. I pulled out every Joe and every Jose in my database. One letter difference in their name. And I looked through everything. What was their education attainment? What companies they worked at? What job titles they held? Where do they live? All sorts of things. So, and then like make these weird sort of, probability distribution people, like all the lifetimes that could have been led and what did it lead to. So Joe is 4 times as likely to reach the C-suite as Jose. Except in DC, where Jose turns out is just as likely to be a CEO as Joe. I don't know about Joseph, but at least with Joe. As a percentage of their respective populations, Jose is more likely to be an MD. But we get into the signaling costs. Let's assume Joe and Jose are both developers. What is the signaling cost for Jose to be as likely to be promoted to senior software developer as Joe? Well, just looking at education to give you a sense of what signaling cost means. Jose needs a master's degree or higher to have the same probability of that promotion as Joe with no degree whatsoever. So now when someone says, I had to work twice as hard to get where I am, I can actually tell you what that is. For Jose, at least in amalgam, that's 6 years of additional school and all of the costs that went into it. That's what he has to signal to people, that he's just as good as Joe. Turns out for women, again, I'm focusing on developers just for the moment. For women, it's very similar, although it's a master's versus a bachelor's degree. But that's still 2 years and all the costs associated with it. So here's an interesting question. Is there a difference between growing up gay in an inclusive environment or an inclusive environment? If later in your professional life, you move. So say someone grows up in Seattle, someone else grows up in Dallas, then 20 years old, they both moved to New York. No difference, right? Economists would say something like, migration takes care of everything. It doesn't. We can go through and measure that signaling cost. So I looked at everyone in my database. So I built classifiers that predict whether people are gay, lesbian, transgender. Actually, that's an interesting story unto itself. Gun owner, Arab, Muslim, Republican, Democrat, the whole shabeel. So I looked at all the ones that were predicted to be gay, and I looked at the subset that grew up in what I defined as an inclusive environment, which included most of the metro regions in the South, versus the ones that grew up in an inclusive environment. You can guess the likely subsets there. And then they all moved to an inclusive environment as professionals, in their 20s. Turns out, the ones from the inclusive environment continue to actually pay a signaling cost the rest of their life. Because they've internalized the idea that it can't be them. They spent 20 years of their lives surrounded by nobody who is openly gay, holding a position of authority. Being a founder, being a CEO, owning their own business, maybe a hairdresser would be openly gay, I have no idea. They don't have that model. Does it matter that Tim Cook came out? If you're from Alabama, it might really matter, because he's from Alabama too. #1 predictor of students from underrepresented populations going to a school like this instead of staying home and going to a second or third tier school. When they got in here, like people think, I don't get it, why do black kids not go to Harvard when they get in? Turns out the #1 predictor that they will is if they knew someone from their community that had gone before them. It's all about knowing that it's possible. And there's a real responsibility of people that have made it to actually go out there and show that it's possible. And I'm not saying we go out everybody, but it really, truly means something. Some of these kids have to work twice as hard. And it's all in their head, and it's all because they didn't know that there was someone like them that had gone before. So that's my ramble and my spiel. And it's really cool work. Socos is actually located here in Berkeley, in case anybody's interested in a job someday. And I also wanted to answer a lot of questions because I transitioned actually here at Berkeley and jointly at Stanford, where I got canned, by the way, by the guy who was the head of that institute. I was front row while I was one of the alumni speakers. I left that. And also just the transition, if anyone's interested, the transition from academia to industry. I have to work with far too many physicists turned data scientists, so I know exactly how often people are. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
I'm curious what you think some of the areas, either geographically or non-geographically, that you think kind of ideas like you're using at Socos can have the largest differential impact?
It's an interesting thing when you talk about diversity. Sometimes people turn off. They feel like you're forcing them to do something. I am answering your question. When I say something like, how much less likely you are to get a job at Facebook if you grew up in St. Louis? A lot less likely. Why? So why are Facebook and Google, two companies that I genuinely respect and who I know a little bit from the inside, are actively working to try and do something better? Why is it that the diversity numbers are so awful? I'm going to tell you one specific thing that sort of has to do with this issue of regionality. And it's kind of simultaneously a symptom and a cause. Employee incentive programs. I'm going to give you $5,000 if you can get one of your friends to join the company. So, okay, I get it, and it's a smart thing to do. If I ask a friend to join the company, or if I refer a friend to our internal recruiters, they're more likely to respond to the recruiter, they're more likely to pass the tech test, they're more likely to be productive in their first year. Why wouldn't I do that? Because you do that for 5 years, and suddenly you've got a monoculture. And it turns out that's been studied also. So it's a catch-22. It's the right short-term thing. The monoculture that emerges out of that sort of behavior is actually detrimental to the long-term value of the company. So again, I don't have to make a social justice argument here, although I think they're totally justified. I can say companies that make more intelligent hiring decisions eventually will start significantly up. Once Facebook and Google figure out how to do it right, other people won't be able to compete with them, not at scale. So some of the regionality stuff, a lot of it is tied to having high densities of individuals. So in other words, lots of examples of good, strong examples of people that are doing interesting work. It's not so surprising that Academics is only slightly less nepotistic than farming. You have these people around you that do this really interesting, fascinating thing. At least they brain you washing into thinking it, and then you go do it also. But then we end up learning these interesting tool sets like programming that then you go out into the world and you turn yourself into a programmer. But it's that intellectual curiosity that really counts for a lot. So I think if I could slap a really interesting university anywhere in the world, give it a few years, and they will very quickly move up that chart, my rankings. But it has to be deep and enculturated, because it's not, oh, I want to learn how to code because I want to earn more money. It's, I'm really curious about how to solve these problems in the world. Oh, there's an interesting tool. I'm going to learn how to code so I can solve those problems. Those are the best performers. And the interesting thing is a ton of research. A very good friend of mine, actually, at NYU, uses machine learning and neuroscience to study incentive systems in rats and in people. And a lot of people research this because they think, oh, I want to have the optimal incentive system to get the most out of my workforce. Whereas my research says, actually, it's the people that are insensitive to incentives that are the best performers. Who is the best salesperson? It's actually the person who closes deals the day after the end of the sales cycle, when everyone else is taking a break. No one cares. Who are the best skateboarders? Is the people that go practice new moves after they defended their world champion. That's an actual personal reference to someone I know. But it holds true. Uniformly, the best people are not motivated by incentives. So those of you who are theoretical neuroscientists in the room, it has to do with the dopaminergic system and what it's responding to. And that those responses are endogenous rather than being driven by these external signals. More questions?
So you mentioned that Guild really started focusing on developers, but have you kind of tried to branch into different careers? Or?
So we have. The historical reason we focused on developers is that the original technical co-founder of the team was a developer, and his original idea, which was still a good one, but it just wasn't enough to flesh out a whole company, was he wrote a bunch of algorithms that went through code and ranked it. He did it because he had a company that didn't take off, that you solved coding puzzles, and then it just algorithmically assessed the code you submitted and ranked it. None of you should be surprised to know that it's a terrible business model. Developers don't need to go solve coding puzzles to get jobs. So the idea, once that company crashed and it got bought by Guild, was what if we took those algorithms and turned them loose on open source code? Every line of it, all over the world. And ranked all of those. And now we have a database that ranks all of the open source developers in the world, which is a few 100,000 people, really genuinely worthwhile. But unfortunately, one of our early customers, Google, who I name only because the New York Times named them, and then they dropped us like a bad habit immediately afterwards. The idea that they needed help in recruiting was not something that they wanted to share with the world. They came back 2 weeks after signing the contract and said, we need more names. So a few 100,000 people sounds like a lot, but it turns out it's not. So I was brought in then to build predictive models. What if 300,000 people's training set instead of a product? And we'll pull in all the LinkedIn data and all the Facebook data and SlideShare and Stack Overflow, and we'll take all of that other data and we'll predict great code. So that's historically why we started, and then how all the prediction models that we built, none of them were developer specific. It was just we had a developer training set. So now I said we've got a 122 million person database, so we do this for salespeople and we do it for designers. It's not nearly as robust for developers because we have this wonderful ground truth, but it's getting there. Yes?
So, kind of going off the fact that you were in education technology, one of the things in like the big political discussions about education reform, especially the progressive side, is that kind of this corporate approach to public education is kind of a teacher, it's kind of trying to standardize everything. How do you feel about that?
It is anti-teacher. So the CEO of Newton, which is a company at least whose employees I respect, some former lab mates of mine are actual employees there, and they genuinely believe in what they're trying to do. They ran a pilot project at Arizona State, and it was declared a success. Oh, can we see the data? No, it's a success. It wasn't perfect, but it was a success. So basically it wasn't a success. It probably trends negative, but you won't admit to it because you can't afford to admit to it. Well, the teachers are too stupid to use our system. And remember, you're talking faculty, not like elementary school teachers. God, what business can you criticize your users like that and get away with it? Well, you can in education. But guess what? You behave that way, and suddenly the teachers don't quite buy in, right? They're the ones that are there on the ground engaging with the students, whether you're talking about college or kindergarten. So what do? What we build are systems to augment the teachers and the parents. Like I said, my goal is to give them superpower. And in a way, the students not even need to know that our system is ever at play. Nor are we sticking iPads in someone's hand. That's not technology. Nor do I think technology is somehow magically either the problem or the solution, it's just a tool. What matters is how we work with that ecosystem, what we can leverage out of it. I want to take a struggling teacher and get them in charge of their class. I want to take an average teacher and make them a master, which is a technical. Take those master teachers and let them do things no one's ever been able to do. Because they won't have to waste, what if even just the idea that they don't have to be grading homeworks and tests, that alone is a huge advantage. All the time you gain back, plus the couple of weeks that you don't have to test prep in class. But much more interesting and meaningful is that idea, being able to present those essentially real-time recommendations. Hey, we do a little clustering. Hey, these 5 kids are tracking together, and we predict that they're not going to understand the material. Here's some recommended interventions. And again, now our recommendations are not because we're trying to optimize the grade, it's because we're trying to optimize their life. So in that sense, I feel really proud. Our goal is to empower the 2 groups of people that are actually engaged with students, teachers and parents, at least in the ideal, that are actually engaged. When they're not, it is our hard job to try and help them be more engaged.
Do you run into a lot of trouble or criticism because of all the data collection that you do and people being concerned about privacy?
It's interesting. There is absolutely a potential. So every now and then we'll see like a tweet, hey, did you see @Guild is doing all this with all of our data? And then no one ever responds. In the entire history of the company, we have an opt-out system. I think a dozen people have opted out. Generally speaking, it's worth opting in. And quite frankly, our recommendations, if you take them as such, are based on 54,000 variables. I already told you what a recruiter looks like. And those variables include the school you went to and the companies you worked at. It just happens those aren't very predictive. But it's all we've got. We leverage it. So I'm very comfortable with what we do with that data. And I think my main recommendation to people that come up, developers who come up to me and say, what can I do to optimize my resume and so forth? I say, do good work and share it. Eventually, people will recognize that. And I don't mean that in the new CEO of Microsoft ES sense. I mean, that really works. It's what people are looking for is great examples of your work. In education, it's a little different. The only areas where you've seen real revolts around data usage is health and education. So the Gates Foundation had a nonprofit they spun up. They put $100 million into this company. I can't remember the name. And just earlier this year, it closed out shop. And their goal was to create a big student database in the cloud, share all of this. I mean, it had the right spirit. They weren't doing it. It was not a for-profit. It wasn't for marketing. It was for the right reasons. But I was at the event where they were building the original idea for that. I had invited to it. They had these major players from Microsoft and state government and the Department of Education were all there talking. And prophetically, the the president of the state's secretaries of education closed the event by saying, I think all these ideas are wonderful and I wish they would work, but it breaks my heart to tell you that my state and 30 others will veto any attempt to collect student data in one place. So culturally, this is a huge challenge. The one thing we're working around for the underage data, it's not a problem with college student data, but the one we're working on with the kindergartners and so forth is we're doing all of the speech processing locally. So all we're extracting from that are the abstracted inferences we're making away from. So there's a drug deal going down in the house. We never know, and that information never actually leaves the house. Unless, of course, we start seeing like a pattern. It becomes like a whole pattern in people's lives. Oh, there's this topic around methamphetamines. So that's partially how we deal with it, is we simply say, you know what? I actually think it's really ugly that Facebook is storing all of my data and probably will end up having a better model of me when I die than anyone else will. When that's me or my son's data, we had to hack that continuous glucose monitor I mentioned. We had to hack that to get that data. It's a hack that another parent came up with. We leveraged it for our system. You aren't there with me at 3 in the morning when I have to do it because I can't do it when he's awake because it hurts too much to put it on. Sticking that wire under his skin so you can get that data of my son's blood glucose levels, and that's your data? Bullshit. So I think when you have transparency and genuine honesty about what you're doing with the data, it at least is a starting point. But you never know where it's going to go. I have a little bit of schadenfreude with that Gates Foundation thing, because that event I described, they didn't tell us that they were going to take all those ideas and start coming with them. It was a little ugly thing for them to do. Apparently, it's not uncommon for their things. Yeah.
Can you see more about where your work fits with the existing social structure of the system? Because on the one hand, it seems like you are questioning it, you are suggesting let's shift our attention from all the standard predictors to this different set of predictors that are actually working better. But on the other hand, given that many of the advantages that people are bringing right now, they came from a long history of having certain advantages, having extra chances, having extra word exposure. So now you are suggesting you're going to pick those people who are going to be most productive, most promising, giving all that extra bunch of helpers that they're standing up on, which sort of refine the system. So
Sure. So I really think of what Guild does and what Socos does as very different, but closely related, very different. And we got covered in the New York Times, and there, in the comment section, there was a criticism just like that. You're just whitewashing the problem, right? How many Jade Dominguez? How many Jades are there? These self-taught Uber kids that, but for being noticed, would be amazing producers. Are we really changing anything? So the way I describe Guild is that its job is to illuminate potential. And I will fully acknowledge that's very different than the real total potential of the populace. But it's also addressing an actual need that people will pay for, and that's a reality in starting a company. And at the very least, there really are people that get missed in that system. Even if somehow magically, we're not addressing these bigger social issues, we are still at least saying, hey, just because this person looks different, sounds different, didn't have the right school, we can still identify that some real potential exists. Socos is about creating that potential. Socos is about going to 2 and 3-year-olds, tracking them all the way through, someone said this should be the title of your book, K through CEO, and getting the most out of them. And those are two very different things, no doubt. And I will be honest, one of the reasons I was comfortable moving on from Guild and working on this white paper for the White House is that I kind of felt like there really was more that we could be doing. Not as a criticism of the Guild. It's not one single startup's job to save the world. What they were doing is better than what people are doing now. That's a step in the right direction. But we can be doing more, and so that's why I really wanted to get back to focusing on education instead. You know, I don't know what to say about how easy it is to fight against sort of the entrenched world, except that it really signals, I hope, to all of you how brilliant a businesswoman I am, that my customers right now are migrant kindergartners and at-risk elementary school kids in New York. I mean, talk about cash flow. We've got lots. But really, we need to be working with institutions that have long-term visions. So state governments, Department of Education, federal governments, universities that can look on 20-year timescales and see that there's actually some benefit. You know, if kids were bonds, they'd be the backbone of the world economy. The amount of money you put into them up front that you can take out the other end is amazing. And the simple truth is, who's going to benefit from that the most? Those kids that got the intervention, their life will be better. They'll make a little more money. Their health outcomes will be better. That's a real, genuine motivator for me. Who's going to recoup that trillions of dollars of gains? The people that already own capital. Yes, I just finished the Tom Spaghetti book. So it's audiobook, actually, because I don't have time to read it. So the reason I put it this way is I want to go. So as I realize I'm just going on and on. So eventually,
Yeah, we'll cut it after this
yes.
question.
So on the board of Start Out, I run research. Why do I run research? Because I want to be able to go to Orrin Hatch and say, we want to start a new chapter in Salt Lake City. And I know you're not going to publicly support us, but you seem like a marginally rational person for a Republican. Here is what happens when we start a chapter in a city. Here's how many new jobs we create. Here is the increase in the GDP. Here's how many new companies are created locally. Yes, shock, they'll have queer founders. But think of all the voters that will have well-paying jobs as a result of you supporting us. In other words, I want to put an argument out there that resonates with as many people as possible. We can all get behind the social justice thing, but nobody else can. And so that and Start Out in Guild and the new endeavors at Socos and Emosia, to me, it comes back to this. Can I use what I know how to do, which is the brain and machine learning and running a business, to actually put some numbers around this, to create an equation that describes the system I'm interested in and optimize that system, and have that system be a person, or a company, or a society. And it sounds kind of idealistic, but I think so. Thank you again.
Please make sure you sign in before you leave and have some more food. Have a great night.